Okay, thanks Yogesh and David for inviting me to the conference, to that session about extraction. My name is Lorenz Minks. I'm from Switzerland. So I'm living in Zurich. I'm also sometimes in Africa. I work for CANNAVIGIA. That's like a software company for track and trace solution for cannabis. We also do a lot of consulting. I'm especially also in the consulting team. One of our guys is also here in the room. Welcome, Wesley, which is also here to contact with you after the session if you have questions or if you want to go deeper in detail. He's your man living in Johannesburg and doing a great job there. So it's really nice to have that connection from the northern to the southern hemisphere in the same time zone. CANNAVIGIA is like a software tool that manages the batch records for plant production, but also for the processing. If you want, you can log everything along the supply chain with your smartphone, with an app, or with the computer, with the software. Maybe I show you at the end a bit of how it could contribute to your success in making everything traceable, as cannabis is still like a highly or gets even more, it's a highly regulated industry, and to catch up all these regulations, it's sometimes important to have a tool. But today for the panel, I think would be good to just talk a bit about general traceability of plant production, of plant material along the supply chain, talking a bit about cleanliness, talking a bit about challenges, and so we will go along the supply chain, I would say. So you see like that graphic here that you will see during the whole presentation to also visualize why and where it's important to track and trace your production process. So of course, or not, of course, maybe you heard about it, that there are two quality standards that you should follow when you have a cultivation site and an extraction site, or when you only do extraction, it might be only the GMP standard. When you only do cultivation to a certain degree, it might be only the GACP standard. So let's bring some light in the confusion, because there's a lot, I would say, especially where does GACP starts and GMP ends. So as a general information, GACP is the good agricultural and collection practice, and GMP is the good manufacturing practice standard. These are both standards from the pharmaceutical industry and should be followed. They are like huge guidelines. They should be followed when you produce things, and they conclude things like documentation duties, quality control duties, like requirements for the cleanliness of a facility, requirement of the validation of equipment in a facility. But one of the most important steps in the ongoing production is, of course, is the track and trace, because that is something workers or management has to do every single day, to track all the things from seed to sale that goes on in the cultivation. So there are two main product categories for cannabis as an API, as an active pharmaceutical ingredient, which we describe like a final product that you can find in a pharmacy. So there are like flowers. It's a really popular product for medical cannabis, so dried flowers. And there are formulations. So something you would do with the buffalo extract equipment would be formulations, where you can make like body lotions or oils or any kind, or like a patch, like further processed products that only has cannabis like as a base ingredient, as a raw ingredient, but the flowers on the other sides, they are they are more like a rare product. So you harvest it, you dry it, and then you sell it as the medicine, just the herb. And it's really popular. So it's really important to also produce the raw flowers under a certain degree of quality standard. So what happened in the last months was that in Germany, one of the most mature medical cannabis markets, the Pharmaceutical Control Authority stated that if you want to sell flowers as an end product, the drying should be under the GMP. So every drying must be under GMP. And I know there were some wild times, like the Wild West times, where you could dry cannabis under the GACP standard, for which you don't need any like certification from a governmental authority. You only get audited by the buying company that sells the product in the end. So GACP is a much lower standard in these regards, but only can be fulfilled when someone in the value chain also has the GMP certificate. But for a long time, it was like the drying could be applied under the GACP, and there was no need for these facilities that cultivate and dry cannabis to be certified for GMP, which comes to an exorbitant cost, of course, like that kind of certification. It could be like easy $1 million or $500,000 just to get GMP certified. So many companies try to get the workaround, but Germany now stopped it. And I think other medical authorities worldwide will follow in the next years, so that it's exciting. But what we can still do when you're a cultivation company, for example, you can produce cannabis flowers and dry it and process it under GACP, and then sell it as a raw material to someone who has like an extraction device, e.g. from buffalo extracts, and makes like final formulations, because then the GACP standard can be applied until the drying and trimming. And there is like a rule of thumb to make it a bit easier for imagination. There should be about 4 processes for an API, for a GMP produced cannabis product before it goes to the buyer, to the patient. So we see in the GMP, we have, when the API is dried whole flowers, we have 4 steps before it leaves the company as the final product. And that should include something like drying, trimming, testing, packaging. Harvest can be GACP. It's a bit wrong in that graphic. But in the GMP, you see you have so many steps, so many production steps that can be done under GMP, that you have also more possibilities to perform more steps under the GACP. But that is just for the beginning, to give you some context about GACP and GMP, the standard, and where they fit in the value chain. And one of the biggest differences we can recognize is when the final product is dried flowers, there are higher standards on drying. They should be under GMP. When the final product is like a formulation, there are lower standards on drying. It can be performed under GACP. So why is that? That is why that is because the impact of the cultivation process on a final product is quite small compared to a flower. Because if you want to sell flower, every action you do, every process you do in your cultivation process really affects the levels of your active ingredients. And if there is a regulation or a specification for your final product, dried flowers, 18 to 22% THC, you don't want to be at 16% or 25%, because then you cannot release your product to the market that you aim for and that you have registered the product for, or your off-taker have registered it for. So there is like a low margin of error that you can do during the cultivation of dried flowers, while on the formulations, you can make the extraction. And I mean, if you have a 20% THC raw material, you can still do a THC oil with 50% THC, but you can also do the 50% THC oil with a 10% THC flower, to say it like that, because then you just need double the amount of the raw material, more solvent, more cost, of course, but still you can do that. And that is what you can do with the kappa, with the corrective and preventive actions. You can find ways in your process flows when you make extracts to say, okay, we can react if the raw material is always a bit different and it's heterogeneous instead of uniform. But in flowers, you can do that. You only can differ a bit in the moisture content, but also only between 8 and 12%. So you cannot really alter the THC percentage that much in the drying process. And also contaminations are a problem in flowers because you cannot get rid of contaminations, let's say insects, beneficial insects that you use for pest management remain on your flowers when they die on your flowers. It's hard to get rid of them, even if you're radiated, they're just dead then, but the material of the dead insects is still on the flowers, while on the extraction method for formulation, you can really get rid of these contaminations in the process. So as a conclusion, when you produce flowers, there should be really a high control process of cultivation, while in the creation of a formulation, the extraction, you have a big margin of error for the raw material because you can correct these to always get to your specified end product in the end. Okay, so let's go through the value chain of what parameters is really necessary to track and trace along the value chain, because track and trace might be an abstract term, and it might be just a pain point, like to track everything in the cultivation. But in reality, it helps a lot. Like, as a short story, there was once an extractor from Switzerland who made CBD oil. So CBD is a big thing in Switzerland. It was one of the first countries allowing it. That's also the reason why I live here. I'm not Swiss. So, and they they bought a lot of bulk material, biomass, CBD flowers from different farmers in Switzerland. And they just stored it in one box and then made an extraction. But the raw material came from, let's say, 10 different farmers. And one farmer just somehow grew some THC on the field and sold the THC without a proper release process. And the extraction company, they made the bulk extraction, like a lot of biomass in one extraction. And they came up with the release test of the CBD oil, and the THC amount exceeded the allowed amount for 1% of THC in the CBD oil, which is a high value to allow 1% in the oil. And still that was exceeded because one of the batches that came into the extraction was over 1%, was like, high THC percentage. And they couldn't follow up which of the suppliers of the biomass was causing that defect. And maybe it was a damage of 100,000 US dollars in the end. And they could not make someone accountable for the damage, because in first hand, it is illegal to sell a CBD oil producer THC material. So implementing a goods in check process, like a receiving goods check process to check the certificates of analysis, or even make an in-house test of the received raw material of the biomass, would have helped a lot. And they could even trace back who caused that financial damage, but they couldn't because they didn't have like any track and trace. So that's why it's so important. And now we can focus a bit on the value chain and where which parameters have to be tracked. So it all starts with the propagation, with the starting material of a plant cultivation. And of course, the first thing that should be traceable is the origin of the starting material. Might it be seeds, or might it be clones or tissue culture? They all should come with phytosanitary certificate in the world, or in Europe, you always have the plant passport as well. So if you procure seeds or tissue culture from Europe, you might have seen the plant passport, but one of those two should be available when you buy plant starting material, and you should store it in your quality management system on your batch record, basically. And of course, the use propagation methods, they have to be tracked. That it's one of the requirements of the GACP standards. So that is the first annoying part, that you have to track. I mean, you know that you make clones or seeds, but maybe someone later on in the value chain wants to know these details. And also the WHO and the European Medical Agency, they require you to track these informations. Then come the vegetative phase of the plant, and these parameters also have to be logged for the flowering and all later steps, but I don't want to repeat them. Then I show you new parameters. But what is important in the cultivation, to track the phase durations of each phase. So vegetative phase for cannabis is mainly 18 hours of lights, that they don't produce flowers. Then for the GACP standard, you have to log how much of plant loss was created, like how many plants died in each phase. Then you have to trace back how much waste was occurred during a process, during a phase. Then you have to log which pest management additives you apply, for example, chemicals, pesticides, but can also be beneficial insects. That is really mandatory to log when you produce in a medical value chain. And also in which areas your plant batches moves around in your facility is really important to track. Also, these things have some useful information for non-compliant things. For example, you want to see if a plant is sick, has some disease, in which area was the plant, that you can check in that area, or are there other plants, maybe also other batches that are affected. So it also helps a lot for the own sustainability of the production company to log these things. In the flowering phase, you log again these things, but also what is important is to log, for example, the fertilizers, chemicals that you have, for example, also cleaning, that you clean your areas should be recorded. You can then make cleaning reports for all your areas that show your off-takers or the regulators, like SAPRA in South Africa, that you work cleanly. You should log observations, for example, if someone seems a bit out of the ordinary or out of the specified process, you should observe it. You don't have to make a pharmaceutical deviation management in that process, but at least you have to check, it also helps to trace if a pest, for example, spreads or it is stable or you can contain it. So you can make photos, for example, in our software and log these. I will show you a report later, just that you see how that works and in the practice. Then you should log the climate data, so that always, if there's some faulty thing in the end of the value chain and someone wants to, to say, no, the cultivator made some problems. It was a really hot summer in South Africa. So maybe the cultivator just had no correct climate. So you can log the climate data for every day, the min-max values, and record it. That also the climate data is traceable, and it's also a requirement for the GACP. And you can trace back how you determined the harvest time. For example, you can make photos with your smartphone and a microscope attached to the smartphone, where you make photos of the trichomes. So if there are 10% amber trichomes, it's a good sign that the batch is ready to harvest. If there are not too much milky or amber trichomes, if all the trichomes are still clear, it's a good sign not to harvest. So that is really important, especially if you produce dried flowers as an end product. But also is important for further extraction, because in the beginning, the plant has CBG in the trichomes, then it has THC and CBD, and later on it even produces CBN. So if the extractor wants to produce CBD or THC, you have to take care that there is no CBG or CBN in your flowers, but the requested cannabinoids, because they transform into each other dependent on the timeline. For the harvest, you want to trace back which harvest methods you used. If it was automatically or manual, it's also a GSP requirement. Then you have to trace back how much wet weight you harvested from your batch and which pre-drying processings were applied. So if you did anything with the plants, you have to log it, like all the quality altering steps. And like putting off leaves is a quality altering step, because the THC value rises when you remove fan leaves and when you when you remove the stems. Of course, you have more flowers in overall, and that also contains the THC. So the overall THC content rises during such a process. So you have to log it. And then the dry and trim, again, that is for like the final product is a formulation, an isolate, something like that. Then you can do that still under GSP. But here would be the point if you want to sell dried flowers, where you should dry under the GMP standard. So you should trace back the drying method. You should record, like again, like in the cultivation, the temperatures and the humidity level during the drying, because drying is really a critical step in the whole process, and there can occur a lot of deviations, because if it's too wet for 2 days, it might be the case that your drying needs a bit longer. So you should maintain with your HVAC systems always the right conditions to dry in the right time. That also helps with process flow. If you harvest one batch every 2 weeks, for example, you don't want to have the one batch drying for 3 weeks, because that stops your whole perpetual growing system in that case. The drying duration has to be recorded. The loss of drying, so you also weigh the dry weight of your batch after drying. That is also important for the narcotics regulations in many countries, that they can observe if someone has stolen material. If they look, you had always 80% loss of drying, but now you only had 70%, so might be something wrong. So that is a really important indicator for security compliance sometimes. Of course, post-drying processes should be logged, like trimming or other kinds of maybe grinding, whatever you do with your material, and the harvest phase has to be recorded. So some of these parameters, of course, are important to log also for your business intelligence if you grow cannabis. Some are just really a compliance requirement, and it is what it is in the end. Okay, so then we come to the GMP part. So that is not my core expertise. Ask buffalo extracts for the technical parts, and professor for the regulatory parts and pharmaceutical pain points. I just want to go again a bit on the track and trace. When you extract something like your plant material, you have to log further on, which can also be done with CANNAVIGIA. The weigh in, for example, when you produce something, you have to weigh it in, you can log that. You have to log the dates when someone was produced. You have to log process durations, the used equipment. You have to log the solvents. Best is like to log everything that goes in batch per batch. So also log the batch of the ethanol that goes into your ethanol extraction if you do some, because also ethanol can be contaminated, and then you want to be sure to say which batches of your formulation was produced with a defect ethanol batch, for example. So it's really important to trace that back. And of course, it's also important to trace back who performed actions along the supply chain. Again, here's also important to track which environmental conditions were in the time of the process, and also parameters of your equipment, for example, pressures or how long was the valve open, things like that. Then the purification also goes to the same line, I would say. You can track how was the purity before and after. That would be an in-process control, which you can log with the exactly outcomes or the results of the in-process control. And you can, you should be able to trace back which quality assurance methods along the production steps you used, just to trace back that is the whole quality management system with all your SOPs, with your test SOPs, with your protocols, with your checklist. That should be really be with the current dates, the current document versions. That's really important to have in the company. That when the auditors come, they see, okay, you really take your documentation and governing of your own company serious. Then the final formulation comes. There you can record which added ingredients were used, for example, sunflower oil or olive oil, or you mix the cannabinoids with some form of body lotion. If that is the product you produce, that can all be tracked, again, batch by batch. So you can say which batch of paraffin was used for the production. You should log the mixing process, and again, in-process control is really important to document, and everything GMP related. For the GACP, that's one of the big differences. You don't need to log too much on like in-process controls. So it's okay if you have like a final release, of your flowers, you say THC content, CBD content, the heavy metals, and everything that is defined in the local pharmacopoeia. Basically, it's a bit different sometimes between, like, Israel might have a different pharmacopoeia than Australia, than South Africa, than Germany, but in the end, it's almost the same ingredients you test for, and that is what's tested like in the final release of the raw material. But if it gets extracted by a GMP company, there's not really the duty of the GACP producer. It's always the responsibility of the GMP producer to make tests, but of course they can mandate you to do that. And in the last step, of course, it's important to log which packaging materials were used, and what was the final results of your final release control. That is here where the heavy metals and contaminants get tested in the end. Like, that is the really valid test that is important when you send out a pharmaceutical product, then you should have that record. And what is really important is that you know which receivers got an API, which customers or which labs or whatever, that you also always can trace back to the receivers, just in case there is something faulty with your release product that you didn't check when you made the final release, but maybe it comes later on. Could be many reasons, and then you have to make a recall procedure. So it helps a lot to being able to trace that back. For that, we have a software, just shortly 3 minutes, where I just want to come in with the release process. Here you see a badge, like how much is it? Is it released? Yeah, it is. The code, the area it is in, and the expiry date. But here you also see the specifications that were tested. For example, heavy metal content, lead, and it has to be smaller as 20 ppm, that you can attach to the articles you want to produce in the software, and then you can check for it for every batch before you release it. And that was released by Wesley, who is here in the room, I assume. And you see these were all passed, these tests, like the results were smaller than here, or that was like just in the range what you have specified. That would be like a THC product, 18 to 22%. Chemovar would be the specifications, and 21.1. Okay, it's all passed, and then you see it's released. It creates a report which you can send to all your buyers, or the authorities can also see that if they make an audit. with all that stuff, so they see the results. You can also make a signature. Here you can sign it, the quality person of a company, and you see all the information that we have spoke about, like the propagation technique, for example, the date when it was sowed, the date of harvest. You see the like the durations of the phases, how many plants were alive in each phase, beginning of each phase. So that is basically all what the regulators want to see. Like it's following the EMA standards and the WHO standards on the drug data sheet. You see the fertilizers and the crop protection additives with the time of the last application. So basically that can be done during the grow. So you just take your smartphone, scan a batch code, a QR code of a batch, and say, now that additive was given, that fertilizer, that task was applied. It all gets logged with a date. Which harvests were done with a plant batch. You can trace all that back, which is really helpful and of course also required. So that was the drying batch of the article we just released. You can trace it back to the plant batch, and then we see, okay, it was started at the 13th of April, for example, and harvested at the 27th of July. So a really brief intro to how such a software could look like. I think Wesley could give you a more detailed impression on that. He's in Johannesburg. He's also at the conference in the room, so please have a chat with him for further questions. Otherwise, just have some inputs on traceability in general. Of course, you don't have to use a software for that. It just helps. You can also make it paper-based, and there are many options basically. But sometimes you just want to save some money on the quality aspects, like the process can be really time consuming, and quality managers might not be the cheapest personnel in the facility.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorenz. I don't know if there are any questions. Are there any questions?
Sunait has a question.
Hi there. Thanks for that. I just don't know if there's anybody from the regulator or from a legal background. From a SAPRA perspective, my understanding is that they don't make a distinction whether you're cultivating to sell flower or to ultimately ship to an extractor. I think the expectation is that your harvest and trimming is GMP compliant, but I don't know if anybody can confirm that. Thank you.
So what I can say to that, I'm not an expert for SAPRA. I'm sure someone here is an expert for that. But when you want to sell to Germany, for example, when that is your offtake market, when you have an agreement with a German company, for example, then the requirement now, since let's say 6 weeks, is really clear. The drying should be with a GMP certificate, which means the facility that does the drying should have should be GMP certified. But that only applies if your end product on the German market is cannabis flowers. If you sell it to an extraction company in Germany, then you still can dry under the GSCP and like GMP compliant or ready or whatever, but not like under GMP.
Thanks, Lorenz. Yes, my question was more related to, from a SAPRA perspective, to essentially to achieve a Section 22C medicinal cannabis cultivation license. But I guess if someone's around, maybe they can.
I think at the moment, for you to be licensed, they are lumping everything. So the inspectorate would come, and they would like to look at everything almost as GMP. But in your actual growing and processing, you have to separate out GACP from GMP. But they've got the pharmaceutical model at the moment with SAPRA, where they're actually licensing you under the GMP inspectorate.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. It looks very intimidating, all the things you have to do. But then if you think that you're actually trying to protect your business, so really whoever you come in contact with, first of all, you need to qualify them. So in business, people are very distrustful of each other until, you know, you've grown that relationship, isn't it? It's like in life, actually, you know, if you meet a woman, she knows, she thinks you don't work. You're still living in your mother's house until she knows you. And, yeah. So I think it's kind of the same approach. And whether it's using software or actually just using, you know, pen and paper, I think the important thing is to keep records so that you can go back, right? So thanks a lot. And, you know, you're free to contact CANNAVIGIA at any point. So I don't know if there are any questions here.
An observation is, you mentioned I'm Wesley, so
Oh, we didn't realize you were.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, feel free to, you know, talk to Leslie afterwards. You can explain further. All right. I thought you were in an online room. Desmond, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Just a very quick question from a business perspective. Look, there's two alternatives at the moment that I'm aware of. The one being the Israeli, and I speak for open field cultivation, just to put some context behind my question. The Israelis have the, what is it called? The Israelis have almost like I don't want to call it global gap, but a TUV system that they use to qualify their product, which involves all kinds of documentation and traceability. I'm asking from a global gap almost perspective, is the system geared to provide a similar platform to the Israeli platform? Sorry, I know I'm asking a vague question.
No, it's a good question. So that software, so we are installed in 4 continents. So we try to emphasize all the aspects, you know, from all the countries. They're all a bit different, but in the end, they are all really similar. Also because quality is the biggest issue, you know. They want to solve each country, each medical authority of the countries with their laws regarding quality assurance. So the content in the reports, it's quite the same, and we fulfill the global gap, of course. That is like a low standard. JCP is a bit higher in the documentation requirements, but also our system goes beyond GACP even that.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so that was a question on global gap. Yeah. Okay. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, so it's just after 12. What we will do instead of Dr. Okole will just very quickly talk about, he's on the phone, but maybe when we go over there about the hub. So what we will now do is we will stop the online meeting. We will post, by the way, we will post this, we'll edit it out and post it on that channel. So you can then follow an edited version of this. And we're also going to post a video of the extraction going on, so in the next week or so. But for us here, we're in the room, you can just go over to that side and get a demo of the instrument. So with that, I'd like to thank the online audience, and I'd like to thank the physical audience. Unfortunately, with the online audience, we cannot provide lunch. So have a good lunch. Yeah, but keep well, and let's talk later. All right. Bye then.